Today I want to talk about the one thing that more than all the other recent rumblings of incipient doom combined has defined our very existence over the past several months. That is this dark and dastardly COVID-19 global pandemic. At the moment of this recording, this poorly understood virus has killed at least 622,000 people worldwide and over 145,000 people in the United States alone. By the time you watch this video, these numbers will have increased by many thousands. And this is all to say that we are smack dab in the middle of this madness. And like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz as she's swept up by the violent swirl of a tornado, we have little way of knowing where we will find ourselves when this whole shebang is over. All we really do know is that life in the wake of this catastrophe is likely to look and feel a bit different than it did before February of 2020. Different in which ways? Well, hey, I'm not going to pretend to know. But comparative politics does provide us with some methods of inquiry that could be useful for drawing basic insights. I've seen from your research proposals that a few of you are already engaged in this process by, say, comparing the responses to pandemics of different regime types to see if one or another political ideological system is better or worse at dealing with this particular kind of crisis. This approach we would call cross-sectional comparison in comparative politics, meaning that it examines multiple cases at a given point in time. It's a good approach, and my hunch is that you'll find something interesting there, even if it's still too early for really conclusive answers. In the meantime, most of what we have to work with comes from temporal comparisons, that is, comparing pandemics in the past to infer causal relationships in the present. But we haven't developed a whole lot of theory from this because A, severe global pandemics have been rare enough that lessons learned from one pandemic cannot readily be applied to other historical periods, and B, there seems to be a widespread belief among modern humans that we've really got this nature thing under control, and this has led scholars away from studying the politics of infectious disease. What we're left with then often feels like somewhat disjointed efforts at historical parallelism that at best provides us only with vague, historically contingent, and often contradictory lessons from the past for dealing with the current crisis. We know, for example, that the black or bubonic plagues that ravaged most of Europe in the mid-14th century, killing somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population there. We suspect that this massive die-off of people fundamentally altered labor relations and also the foundations of political legitimacy in ways that would eventually undermine both the old feudal order and the Catholic Church's monopoly on all things knowable in much of Europe, thus creating the conditions under which capitalism and the modern nation state could begin to thrive. Now, based on this experience, we might then conclude that pandemics act like great equalizers. They are, in essence, just the price a society pays, albeit a very high one, for the chance to throw off the shackles of tyranny and superstition. On the other hand, if we look at smallpox and similar epidemics brought to the Americas by European explorers and colonists after the 15th century, well, we'd likely come up with very different conclusions. In this case, the mass die-offs of anywhere between 60 and 90% of the entire Native American population from present-day Canada to the southern tip of Brazil, all within the span of 100 years since Cristóbal Colón's first docking in the Bahamas, certainly did not help anyone throw off the shackles of tyranny. Au contraire, this plague set Latin America on a path to becoming the most unequal region in all of the world. Preliminary evidence from the COVID-19 pandemic suggests that, like the smallpox epidemics throughout the Americas, we are more likely to see inequality increase as a result and not decrease. This isn't because the rich will necessarily get richer, but rather they will simply be able to weather the economic fallout of the pandemic without losing their asset wealth, while the lower middle classes and lower classes may well get knocked back down into the old poverty trap zone. Moreover, while coronavirus itself might be colorblind, the significant overlapping of race and class in many countries may ensure that deepening inequality as a result of the pandemic will be, to some degree, racially imbued. On the other hand, today's crisis absolutely pales in comparison to the decimation of Native America after 1500, or to the Black Death for that matter. So far, it also seems to pale in comparison to the 1918 influenza, best known for its geographically inappropriate moniker, the Spanish flu. Between 1918 and 1919, that weird strand of the flu killed off as much as 5% of the entire global population, which at today's population level would amount to about 400 million people. Thankfully, COVID-19 doesn't appear to be nearly so deadly. In any case, there are quite a few similarities between the 1918 influenza and COVID-19, and analytically speaking, these similarities could be more useful for deriving relevant lessons for today's crisis because the historical contingency is now only a century apart rather than 5 centuries or 7 centuries. So, is there anything we can learn from the 1918 flu that has relevance for today? Well, there's lots of things to be sure. For example, paranoia, prejudice, and distrust drive people to point the finger of blame at social groups who are already targeted as outsiders or undesirables, thus opening the way for a politics of xenophobia and exclusion. We also know that where social distancing is enforced, pandemic spreads tend to be far more measured and controllable. But perhaps the most shocking lesson of all concerns our amazing ability as a human society to simply sweep enormous tragedies under the rug and then just forget about them, especially when they don't give us effective raw material to create deeply resonating narratives about human struggle. What I mean to say here is that as humans, we tend to love stories of romance and war because they give us so many ready-made heroes and villains. All the stuff that naturally help us to impose a sense of order on an otherwise chaotic, nihilistic existence. But with pandemics, the heroes tend to be humdrum and the villains are invisible. There is only fear, waiting, sickness, and death. Not enough to fill the plot of a best-selling novel. According to historian John Barry, author of The Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest plague in history, this is a big part of why there is virtually no art, film, or literature about the 1918 flu in the United States, despite the fact that it killed about 7 times more Americans than the First World War did. And of course, the war itself provided raw material for a century of books and films about bravery, sacrifice, and the ever-present allure of senseless violence. Now, if we apply this lesson to today's crisis, does it then suggest that a few years from now we will barely remember these COVID times at all? Even though the pandemic might well provoke major changes in politics and society at the structural level, our collective amnesia will be so great that we will be unable to trace those changes to their actual source? I'm not going to lie, I do worry about that. I mean, so much pain and suffering over so many rueful and lonesome months, and not even one blockbuster thriller to show for it. But then, a whole lot has changed since 1918. For starters, we know a lot more about the nature of pandemics today, and the field of medical science is far larger and more institutionalized than before, such that this alone may help keep alive the memory and shape the meaning of the current crisis. Furthermore, there are likely to be more pandemics and more frequently in the future due to the growing world population and to increased global travel. And so even if we forget about the coronavirus tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, we might just be reminded again, and then again, and again, and again, until we cannot possibly forget the politics of infectious disease because it will be so integral a part of our lives. Whatever the case, this is where you, probably more than I, will make the difference. What consequences do you foresee for politics and society that stem from the COVID-19 pandemic? Are there major political changes on the horizon, on par with those that followed the Black Plague or the smallpox epidemics? Or should we expect any changes that do occur to be largely overlooked and forgotten, like after the 1918 influenza? I'm Professor Mike Wolf, and this is Comparative Politics Online.